It's my pleasure to welcome, for the first lecture in Boise Hall, Robert Blair Kaiser.
My ears perked up, Father Bob, when you described this center as not your average Newman Center in defense of nothing. You have nothing to defend against. You're doing the same thing at Yale that I was doing at Time Magazine and the New York Times. I was just being a good journalist. And I wasn't trying to convert anybody, but everybody knew it. I was a Catholic and a former Jesuit, and I had an influence there. And those organizations had an influence on me. And I think that's what happens here at Yale, that you're not only incarnate in the life of Yale, but Yale is having an influence on you. It's making you more whole. Because we can't be incarnate in anything without back and forth. We learn from our world around us. And that world is a good world, as I will try to outline in my talk about the spirit of Vatican II. I'm really honored to be here and to meet Jeff and Rain Boise. Heard so much about you and what you've been doing. I watched your beginnings with the round table. I've admired the work of Carrie Robinson, not only with the round table, but with the center here. And I'm terribly impressed with what you've done. If this is a model for other Catholic centers around the country, how lucky they are to have you guys blazing some trails, I think. It was at Vatican II that I found out that some of the best bishops, some of the best U.S. bishops at Vatican II had been Newman Club chaplains. And I asked myself why that was. And I don't know if this is a complete answer, but I think these bishops were more secular, less sectarian. They were more in the world, the real world. And that's what made them produce some of what I call the spirit of Vatican II, and I'll go into that. Anyway, I hope I haven't left anybody out. The hospitality here has been so great, and I'm so impressed with the staff and the kids and the thoughts that were expressed at our prayer service by the 4 students. Terribly impressed. I can't remember the name of the young lady who said she might go to medical school, but you can be all you want to be. I know that. In 1962, Time magazine sent me to Rome to cover Vatican II. That gave me a 50-yard line seat at one of the great contests of history. For me, the council was a kind of ecclesiastical Super Bowl, and I covered it like the battle it was, between the forces of change and the forces of no change. The council, as you know, was closed to the press, so I had to find other ways of getting inside. I adopted some of the council fathers and their theologians, and they adopted me. One day, early in the first session of the council, I arranged to meet the English Jesuit T.D. Roberts, the retired Archbishop of Bombay, and I ended up bringing him home to dinner. He stayed for 2 years. He was the Archbishop who came to dinner. He said Mass in English. This is before we decided we were going to have Mass in the vernacular. He said Mass in English every evening on our dining room table with me and my now deceased wife Susan and our 2-year-old Polly sitting on her lap. In effect, he became my own council father in residence. When he came home from the council every day, he brought home the day's documents, all stamped sub secreto, in Latin, of course, and handed them over to me. And he brought me something else, an ever-increasing crowd of bishops from around the world who came to see him and to enjoy some Time Inc. hospitality, lots of food and drink, at sit-down dinners at our table for 8. One Sunday night, when 3 uninvited guests showed up, we improvised and set up a buffet supper instead. Hey, we thought, why not a buffet supper every Sunday night, and the more the merrier? Soon, my wife and I were hosting buffet suppers every Sunday night for 60 or more bishops and separated brethren and Jewish observers and many a council theologian. After dinner, and after Archbishop Paul Hallinan of Atlanta had finished playing our piano and leading the group in Irish songs, my theologians and my bishops would often put their heads together and draft some speeches for the coming week. Even some of the separated brethren at those parties, I'm thinking of Albert Outler, representing the Methodists at the council from Southern Methodist University, and Robert McAfee Brown, representing the Presbyterians, and George Lindbeck, representing the Lutherans, George Lindbeck of the Yale Divinity School, who were asked for and gave their input week after week to the bishops who were at my parties. And the bishops listened to them and made emendations in their interventions and helped to produce documents that were more amenable to the separated brethren that belonged. Of course, the bishop said, of course, why didn't we say it that way? If it hadn't been for you, we would have said it the wrong way. So these 3 men, particularly Outler, Brown, and Lindbeck, are a little noticed American contribution to the council. T.D. Roberts also brought home a good many stories. To understand the joke, you have to recall that the Council of Trent, which had frozen the church into the juridical church that Pope John was trying to change, was several hundred miles away from Rome in the Italian Alps. One of Archbishop Roberts' best stories recounted the tale of Cardinal Ottaviani, who was so miffed when they cut off his microphone for an overlong speech one day that he stayed away from the council for 2 weeks. What had happened? Well, Archbishop Roberts came home with this story, picked up at the Bar Jonah. There were 2 bars behind the St. Peter's altar, the Bar Jonah and the Bar Rabbis, where the bishops could repair to and have a cup of coffee or a brandy in the middle of the morning. Lots of good conversations went on there, maybe better than on the council floor in some cases. Well, Archbishop Roberts came home with this story. The morning after Cardinal Ottaviani's rebuff, his limo driver didn't show up. So he hailed a passing taxi and said to the driver, "Al concilio," to the council. And so the cab driver drove him to Trent. Another fun story. One of the regulars at my Sunday nights was Francis Xavier Rynn Murphy, who was writing pieces in the New Yorker to great effect. And I didn't begrudge him the fact that he was getting most of his stuff at my Sunday nights, because we were co-conspirators together in the effort to get into the secular press, not the Catholic press, what was really happening at Vatican II. And so the Catholic, he became a good friend, and we shared a lot together. But someone had, Catholic Herald in England had put together a limerick contest after the first session of the council, and the winning limerick went something like this. There was a New Yorker named Rynn whose reports, when in doubt, he kept thin. But Bob Kaiser of Time thought conjecture no crime, and every doubt Rynn left out, he put in. This is these are some of the fun parts of what I mean when I frame my talk as the human side of Vatican II. For me, there was no other side to report on other than the human side. As the council opened, I sought out America's most famed Catholic preacher, Fulton Sheen. He was staying at the Excelsior, the priciest hotel on the Via Veneto, to ask him about his hopes for the council. He turned down my request by denying the very humanity of the council itself. It will be all about the Holy Spirit, he said. He will tell us what to say and do. Bishop Sheen didn't tell me how I should go about interviewing the Holy Spirit. But I went on to interview almost everyone else I could find, often in 18-hour days, and much to my surprise, I was getting stories about the council into the magazine almost every week. And then at the end of the council's first session, Dick Clerman, my chief of correspondence at Time, gave me 6 weeks off to do a book on that first session of the council. And so I wrote the book in 6 weeks, working pretty much around the clock. The Observer of London serialized the book in August 1963, installments on page 1 every Sunday for 4 Sundays in a row. And when the book came out in London and Dublin, it shot to #1 on the bestseller list. In the book, I used an extended metaphor, imagining the church as the bark of Peter, a ship that had been in port for too many centuries, its bottom so encrusted with barnacles that it could no longer sail. Now, by calling a council, I said that Pope John had figuratively launched that vessel out onto the seas of the world. Pope Paul VI liked that image so much that he got Monsignor Luigi Liguti, one of his American Monsignor friends who was living in Rome, to ask me for permission to have my book translated into Italian and published for the benefit of the Italian bishops so they could better understand what the council was about. The bark of Peter now launched onto the seas of the world. The image underlined what was different about Vatican II. For all the other councils of history, 20 of them, the church turned inward on itself. This council turned out to the world. Not everyone understood that right away. Pope John's Curia didn't get it. They may have never gotten it. The most curious among you might want to read Yves Congar's Journal of the Council, a daily diary of his exhaustive and exhausting work behind the scenes as a council peritus brought to Rome by John the 23rd, battling with Cardinal Ottaviani and his chief aide, the Dutch Jesuit Sebastian Tromp. I think Congar was probably one of the 2 or 3 most important theologians at the council, and I urge you to get it. I have it on my iPhone as an ebook. It's about 1,000 pages. I've been reading it on my trip. I just got back from a 3-week trip to India, lecturing in 9 Indian cities in 18 different groups. And I kept reading Congar's account, and it was spicier than anything I had written in Time magazine. To get ready for the council, Ottaviani and Trump were crafting a compendium of the faith, doing everything they could to model Vatican II in the style of the precise propositions and definitions and anathemas that were forged at the Council of Trent and enlarged upon through the decades that followed by the ordinary teaching magisterium of the Church. These propositions, like the gold bars at Fort Knox, were cool, carefully dimensioned, unchanging. Indeed, the prefect of the Holy Office during the Council, Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, had a coat of arms inscribed with the words Semper Idem, always the same. This is all wrong, Congar wrote. This is papalist nonsense. It is making the council into a textbook manual that will not help bring about the aggiornamento Pope John the 23rd is calling for, a recreation of what the faith was in its primitive beginnings. To rediscover the beauty of that faith, we have to take a deeper look at sacred scripture and study the fathers of the church. And only then will a council speak to the world in language it can understand. I like an image that your chaplain, Father Bob, used in a recent homily. If you break your arm, you can heal it by putting it in a cast. But you can't leave the cast on for too long or your arm will wither. After Trent, the hierarchs left the cast on our broken church for 400 years. it comes as little surprise that atrophy set in. Reading Congar's accounts now, I realize my reports in Time and my book on the first session reflected only dimly what a fierce battle was going on. For a month, the Observer advertised my series in a poster that appeared in all the London tube stations. It screamed out the headline, "The Plot to Thwart Pope John." Read Congar and you will see that headline was an understatement. You know that the battle about the meaning of Vatican II is still going on, with Pope Ratzinger himself insisting the Council didn't change the Church very much, and his one-time colleague Hans Küng saying it didn't change the Church nearly enough. To me, and I suspect to many of you who style yourselves as Vatican II Catholics, both views minimize the Council. I do agree with Hans Küng. He was a friend of mine. We used to drink rusty nails together till 2 in the morning toward the end of my Sunday evening parties. Vatican II does have some unfinished business. The Council Fathers started a discussion on collegiality, which, taken to its logical end, could have led to a more democratic church. Pope Paul VI, fearing that move would destroy his sovereignty, which is not a biblical word, it's a power word, derailed that discussion. Someday, the hierarchs will decide that the Pope's sovereignty gets in the way of his humble service to humankind, and they will correct that. In the meantime, many of us are letting our gloom over the unfinished business cast a shadow on all the good things that happened at Vatican II. Vatican II changed the way we thought about God, about ourselves, about our spouses, our Protestant cousins, about Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, and Jews, even the way we thought about the Russians. During the first session of the Council, when a handful of bishops kept pushing for a conciliar condemnation of communism, John XXIII kept insisting that that kind of talk would blow up the world. Pope John and his council's restraint made some moves that helped end the Cold War. Before the Council, we thought we were miserable sinners when we were being nothing but human. After the Council, we had a new view of ourselves. We learned to put a greater importance on finding and following Jesus as the way, as opposed to what we said in the Creed. It didn't matter so much what we said. What mattered was what we did, helping to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and find shelter for the homeless. That's what made us followers of Jesus. Footnote here at the center, at St. Thomas More Center. It strikes me that you're not only an intellectual center in the midst of Yale, but not simply a head thing, but a heart thing too. You're real Catholics. You believe in the sacramentality of everything, and your Wednesday soup kitchen is a testament to that, and that cannot but have a great effect on the wider community here at Yale. So we Catholics are not only thinking Catholics, we're feeling Catholics, and you show it. Before the Council, we were told we were excommunicated if we set foot in a Protestant church. After the Council, where Protestant observers were welcomed, given seats of honor, and spoken of no longer as Protestants but as separated brethren, we stopped fighting the Methodists and the Presbyterians and conspired with them in the fight for justice and peace and marched with them to Selma. Before the Council, we thought only Protestants read the Bible. After the Council, we've seen a new Catholic appreciation of the Scriptures. They've been given a more prominent place at Mass, and in many parishes we have groups gathering every week for Bible study. Have I forgot to mention that now we have Mass in English and French and Spanish and Swahili and Urdu and Japanese and 150 dialects from Northeast India rather than in Latin, the language of the elite? Before the Council, we took pride in knowing that we were the only people on earth who could expect salvation, according to the centuries-long mantra, no salvation outside the Church. After the Council, we began to see there was something good and true in all religions. And we didn't think we had all the answers. After Vatican II, we started thinking of ourselves not as the one true church, we were a pilgrim people. It was a phrase that summed up an image of a band of humble travelers on a journey who, though we are subject to rain and snow and high wind and hurricane, to thirst and starvation and pestilence and disease and attack by leopards and locusts, keep on plodding ahead with a hope and a prayer that we will somehow reach our destination. The image was calculated to counter an old self-concept that hadn't stood up to scrutiny, of a triumphal church that had all the answers, lording it over humankind. Before the council, we identified salvation as getting to heaven, being good so we could go somewhere else. After the council, we knew that we had a duty to bring justice and peace to the world in our own contemporary society, understanding in a new way the words that Jesus gave us when he taught us to pray, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth, as it is in heaven." Before the council, we were sin-obsessed. It was even a mortal sin to eat a hamburger on a Friday night after the game. After the council, we had a new sense of sin. We didn't hurt God when we sinned. We sinned when we hurt somebody else or ourselves. After the council, we had a new, holy, hopeful view of ourselves, redefining holiness as the famous Trappist monk Thomas Merton once did: to be holy is to be human. Before the council, we were told we were condemned to hell if we made love to our spouses without at the same time making babies. After the council, we knew we had a duty and the pleasure to make love even if we could not afford to have another baby. Late in the fourth session of the council, after Pope John had gone to heaven, the council fathers remembered that he had wanted to put the kibosh on a number of imagined isms, all of them abstractions. When they were asked during the editing phase of Gaudium et Spes to approve a condemnation of eroticism, one council father pointed out, "In se, eros habet aliquid boni." In itself, there's something good about erotic love. He urged his colleagues not to condemn erotic love, and they agreed with him overwhelmingly. This was a small but significant example of the humanity and the common sense that prevailed among most of the 2,500 bishops and their theological advisors when they were taken out of their overprivileged, overprotected mansions and made to fend for themselves in a city suddenly overpopulated by bishops. In Manhattan, Cardinal Spellman moved about in a limo. In Rome, he'd walk 7 blocks over to my office from his digs at the Grand Hotel to bring me a council document that he thought I ought to see. Cardinal Spellman and the other bishops were not only allowed to be themselves, they soon realized they were being encouraged to exercise something we Americans had always prized: free speech. For 4 shining years, we had free speech in the church. After the council, things began to change. Up to now, the bishops have been part of the ecclesia, going back to that first session. Up to now, the bishops have been part of the ecclesia docens, the teaching church, while the rest of us were the ecclesia discens, the learning church. Here at the council, the bishops all became part of the learning church. Hobnobbing with theologians like Congar, Danielou, Chenu, Skillebex, Hans Kung, and John Courtney Murray, they began to start speaking of the church in new ways, promising to create a new kind of church, a people's church, not a church that was making itself less and less relevant by being too damned happy with itself. Some of the best council speeches were now calling for a church that believed God was at work in all men and women, in individuals as well as in humankind as a whole, a church that wanted us to be all we could be, in this life as well as in the next. Before the council, we thought God spoke directly to the Pope and that he passed the word down the ecclesiastical pyramid to the bishops, and then to the priests, and then the nuns, and properly filtered to us. Coverage of the conciliar debates by the media showed us the real church didn't work that way. We saw the church, in the person of the bishops, making up its mind with the kind of stormy arguments that go on in any parliamentary body. After the council, we learned a new geometry. The church wasn't a pyramid, it was more like a circle, where we are all encouraged to have a voice. We were told that we are the church. The council fathers said we have a right and a duty to speak out about the kind of church we want to be. That was the theory, anyway. Please note that most of these changes did not come about because the Fathers of Vatican II revamped what we had already professed in the Creed. They didn't change our faith. They didn't come up with a new understanding of God. Still one God, two natures, three persons. Only in this sense can I agree with Pope Benedict XVI when he keeps insisting on something he calls the hermeneutic of continuity. I have to agree with him when he says the Council didn't come up with any new dogmas, and thank God for that. The last thing thinking Catholics want are dogmas of any kind. Dogma and dogmatic are words that do not much resonate with. When I think of dogma, I think of the hundreds of anathemas, 325 of them, laid down by the Council of Trent. Believe these dogmatic propositions or be damned. When Jesus addressed the multitude on that hillside overlooking the lake, he did not enlighten their minds by reading them the 10 Commandments. He enkindled their hearts by telling them what would make them happy. I know most English translations of the Beatitudes use the word blessed, but I prefer the less pious, more human, even more literal Latin translation, happy. Jesus wanted to make people happy. The Council Fathers did not follow the example of Trent. They followed the example of Jesus. They did not anathematize anyone or anything. They set up a new style of thinking about ourselves as followers of the guy who told us how we could have life and have it more abundantly. We make a mistake if we comb through the 16 documents of Vatican II and hope to find explicit warrants for the church we want to see take shape in the future. We can only capture the real revolutionary meaning of the Council by looking at the new kind of language that permeated all these documents. It was not the kind of legalistic language Cardinal Ottaviani loved. The American Jesuit John W. O'Malley, author of the most authoritative work on the Council, What Happened at Vatican II, says the Council's message was hidden in plain sight. Father O'Malley describes it by contrasting the old language with the new. At stake were almost two different visions of Catholicism, from commands to invitations, from laws to ideals, from definition to mystery, from threats to persuasion, from coercion to conscience, from monologue to dialogue, from ruling to service, from withdrawn to integrated, from vertical to horizontal, from exclusion to inclusion, from hostility to friendship, from rivalry to partnership, from suspicion to trust, from static to ongoing, from passive acceptance to active engagement, from fault-finding to appreciation, from prescriptive to principled, from behavior modification to inner appropriation. Mere words? I do not think so. They underline my thesis that the Council set a new style of thinking. It helped us all be more real, more human, and more loving. The Council helped us realize that the world was a good place. It was good because God made it, and He made it because He loved us, and He loved the world too, and He wanted us to help make it better. In effect, the Council gave us our agenda for the future, pointing us toward a goal that we will never fully reach, being all we can be. In this sense, Vatican II will never be over. The great Asian theologian Aloysius Pyrrhus makes a neat distinction between reform and renewal. Reforms are undertaken and controlled and codified at the center of the church. Meanwhile, out on the church's periphery, the people of God continue to see how they can continue making things better, as in fact the human race has been trying to do through all of human history. The hierarchs, who are generally interested in keeping everything under control, may not like all the uncertainty entailed in this kind of experimentation. But in a healthy thinking church, healthy thinking, feeling church, I do not believe there is any way to stop the process of renewal. It is going on today in the church's periphery, whether the Vatican likes it or not. The renewal goes on in movements like the emerging church, something less sectarian, more pan-Christian, as National Catholic Reporter's editor Tom Roberts describes it in his book, The Emerging Church. And it goes on in the small faith Eucharistic communities all over the world that do their own masses, often without a priest present, believing that where 2 or 3 are gathered together in Jesus' name, he is there in the midst of them. Aloysius Pyrrhus says the core of any religion is the liberative experience, the salvation experience around which the religion evolved. In fact, the vitality of any given religion depends on its capacity to put each successive generation in touch with that core experience of liberation. This means that a religion would die no sooner than it is born if it fails to evolve some means of perpetuating that experience. Or, as the author of John's Gospel tells us in verse 8, chapter 3, the Spirit blows where she wills. This is for us the real meaning of Vatican II. Let the Spirit inspire us. Let the Spirit live in us. The future of the church, the future of Jesus on this planet is up to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert Kaiser, for your delightful paper, which I read with great interest. And my remarks are really directed to try and raise some issues, questions that I hope we can engage in conversation. You offer a narrative of anecdotes of an embedded reporter's view of Vatican II with an emphasis on what you call the human side of the structural order of the assembly. Much of the account is also about your own personal role in the activities surrounding the council, and in that regard, you offer a provocative thesis, which you state as follows. In the midst of the clerical scandals, the memory of Vatican II and its accomplishments are the only things that will save the church. I gulped at that bold assertion. Liberal Catholics contend that Vatican II did not go far enough, while conservative Catholics maintain that it went too far. The liberal critics feel that the church should embrace, with few qualms, democratic principles in church governance, essentially taking more seriously the role of women and the laity in the running of the church. Pope Benedict XVI, you suggest, reject this view of authority and is set on pulling back from that kind of openness. In the tension between the liberal and conservative contentions, Vatican II emerges then not so much as a failure as a catalyst of Catholic intellectual development. Vatican II frames the terms in which Catholics try to reposition themselves in the world they know, as opposed to a world they must flee. By general consent, the gains of Vatican II were immense and enduring, representing an epochal shift of attitude to faith and to the world. The strains of affirmation that you enumerate so well, welcome, solidarity, ecumenical charity, interfaith openness, attentiveness to a changing world, are now too strong a part of the permanent legacy of the Council to be ignored. The genie is out of the bottle. I am struck by Kaiser's emphasis on how Vatican II made the Church more human. And I find his argument here really compelling and revealing. The contrasts he draws between before and after are as sharp as they get. The difference, in fact, between night and day. In his language, between a priest-ridden church overseeing a retarded and culturally underprivileged faithful, and an emancipated, joyful church filled with affirming, humble, and justice-loving followers of Jesus. The church, as a venerable anachronism, was subsumed in the church as an agent of change. The triumphant church gave way to the servant church as tradition and conformity yielded to innovation and initiative. Whereas the church had been marooned as a world-denying pious enclave, now it was invested in the cause of the poor and the oppressed here and now. The pilgrim life came to define the church in place of the stultifying church as a musty citadel. Kaiser insists, the church is not set apart for the work of God. The church is empowered in the work of God, becoming the church in the process of being human amidst the joys, the tribulations, the triumphs, and the disasters of life. The obligations of faith must now be discharged through the duties of our common humanity. And according to this reading, Vatican II was an ecclesiastical Copernican revolution, in which the church ceased to be the center of the world, so that the world could become the center of the church. Sin was no longer an offense against God. It was wrong done to our neighbors and fellow human beings. Although it produced a whiplash effect among old diehards, including many ensconced in the bosom of the Curia, this massive change amounted to a seismic shift. And Kaiser is eloquent in raising a paean to it. Kaiser gives us an image of the church not as a structure, but as a series of engagements concerned with the human side of life, with faith itself as a humanization process directed to advances in human rights and democratic freedom. Several questions arose in my mind at this point, and I wonder how adequate some of the images are to describe the church. Kaiser describes how he wrote an article comparing the church to a boat that had been in port for far too long, for many centuries, so weighed down with crustacean residue that it could not sail, which was its sole purpose in the first place. Vatican II, he continues, had figuratively at long last launched that vessel into the open seas. It is a thought-provoking metaphor, but I had a caveat. If the metaphor works at all, then the boat must be fitted with a compass, and the crew and passengers must stay within bounds. Structure here is the difference between steering a course and drifting. If it is not the church, another structure must do that job. And in that case, I do not know how we should assess and evaluate the alternative structure. Vatican II, I agree, seems eloquent enough vindication of the necessity of structure that is the church. After all, it was the church that launched Vatican II. I like to develop this idea with the help of a second metaphor Kaiser introduces, the geometric design of the new post-Vatican II reality as a circle rather than as a pyramid. It's a very arresting idea, and it seems to me to grow logically out of the nature of the church, such as, for example, James Joyce describes in Dublinus. There is, again, a caveat. The story of Pope John XXIII broadcasting on Telstar 1 as the first satellite transatlantic TV transmission, Kaiser observes, demonstrated a new way of thinking about the world and our relation to it. Mass media would usher in unhindered communication as the basis of understanding an encounter. And that line of development must diverge, Kaiser suggests, from the trajectory of a lumbering, moribund religious institution wrapped in secrecy. But here is the problem. The modern world, as the object and subject of the Church's life, is far from being itself innocent, as Pope Pius XII noted in his sobering and somber reflections on the tragic history of his time. As another writer, Arthur Koestler, predicted in the decade just before Vatican II, the geometrical design of the evolution of communication and understanding will reach the point of near saturation, bringing about instant global interconnectedness, but without that making for moral cohesiveness and a unified awareness among people. People would possess the power and the means of accessing information and knowledge without the capacity for moral consistency and ethical action. It echoes a line in Francis Bacon, who, contemplating the immense powers that human beings were going to acquire as a result of the new science and technology in the 16th century, reminded his contemporaries that nature should be embraced not as a courtesan for pleasure, but as a spouse for fruit. People, therefore, would need to acquire the moral capacity to cope with the immense freedoms and powers they enjoy. Koestler predicted that the future advent of virtual communication would not remove intercultural impediments. And I quote him, "The stupendous amplification of vision and hearing would cause a rapid deterioration of the intellectual and moral content of communication. You can now actually go on the internet without any regard whatsoever to cultural or moral criteria and do there anything you want to do." Our diagrams, Koestler continues, show an unprecedented increase in the range and power of the species' sensory and motor organs, coincident with a marked deterioration of the integrative functions which determine spiritual maturity and ethical and social ethics. The implication is that the challenge of the modern age is to persuade humankind to do more than to acquiesce in its own demotion. Sort of echoes a little bit the thought of the great French Jesuit, de Lubac. Without a coherent ethical framework, the threat to human prospering and to the fabric of the common good, as the Catholic bishops have defined that, would accelerate, spreading conflict and intolerance. Koestler described how, in another instance, the results of applied religion have created a vacuum at the heart of Europe, requiring a new emotional charge to fill the space of spiritual conviction. Pope Benedict actually has, in the last several years, been trying to prescribe exactly for this condition. The new imperatives of human destiny took down the altars to give people the illusion of a newfound sense of exhilaration, but occupying a lower order than men and women without being able to offer any guidance for conscience. The shift from destiny from above to destiny from below shut us to our own machinations and fabrications. In reading Kaiser's stimulating and often entertaining account of Vatican II, I am struck by an issue that seems to rumble through his anecdotes concerning the deliberations of the bishops. And that is how questions of authority and hierarchy hinged on questions of updating the Church's outlook on the world. The polarity between God and the world, for example, is intertwined with the issue of the polarity between the sacerdotal office and the secular life, between the institution and the human. The actions taken at the Council try to remove the theological polarity in the move to reconcile the secular and the sacerdotal. On this subject, I am unsure how to grade the Holy Father today, given his own views about the importance of reason for faith and practice. That actually was the real subject of his famous Regensburg address before it got away from him. At any rate, it reminds us of the Pope's inaugural statement, if you remember, in April 2005, at the time of his election. He spoke about how he viewed his pontificate as being one of reconciliation among Christians and with others. Building bridges, I think was the metaphor that came to mind, would distinguish his career, he indicated. Maybe it's too early to give a verdict on that, but it does show, I think, that the hierarchy today seems to be less invested in itself than it was before Vatican II. It is significant that it was a senior Muslim official who came to the Pope's defense to say, after the Pope's visit to the Holy Land a few years ago, that Regensburg is over. In contrast, many Catholics are less willing to bury the hatchet on that. The world church at long last, the world that the church has at long last embraced with such invigorating openness at Vatican II, was also a world in a state of profound conflict about truth and justice. The achievement of Vatican II cannot be gainsaid, no, not if we heed what Kaiser and John O'Malley, in their different ways, have told us. Today, critics at one end of the spectrum merely lament the fact that the reforms of the Council have not been applied more widely and more thoroughly, while at the other end, opponents have regretted that the Council went too far, too fast. But all are agreed that the Church is not the same by reason of it. It would be fair to ask what is the most appropriate and fitting way to describe the reality and the consequence of what took place. I have two questions as a follow-up. One is about the circle as a suitable substitute for the pyramid as a figure of the new church. St. Bonaventura has said somewhere, I forget, that the nature of God is a circle of which the center is everywhere and the circumference is nowhere, suggesting that moving the circle from a theocentric to an anthropocentric position would give it a circumference as the stakeout of contention and rivalry. Or would it? Even if desirable and culturally meaningful, is that the outcome we should expect from Vatican II? I ask purely in innocence. The second has to do with Catholicism as a global faith present in the remotest corners of the world today and practiced through an infinite diversity of tongues and idioms. It doesn't come up as such in Robert Kaiser's presentation, which probably fairly reflects the Church's Euro-American self-image in the 1960s. Yet by 1962, that image was changing significantly. The church, the center of gravity of the new kind of church the documents of the Council designed, was already shifting from the northern to the southern hemisphere as the post-Western phase of Catholicism was beginning. It was masked and concealed by the Cold War and by the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is 50 years today. But it was no less momentous for all that, as the pontificate of John Paul II demonstrated in time. This religious revolution is having an impact on Europe and North America, as Andrew Rice, a Catholic reporter for the New York Times, recently reported. And I quote him, "The story is familiar within the Catholic Church, the world's largest Christian denomination. Roughly a third of the College of Cardinals currently hails from the global south, lending support to predictions that someday, perhaps quite soon, they will elect a non-European pope." I met a senior official at the Vatican recently who echoed that sentiment, and when I looked somewhat skeptical, he looked at me sternly and he said, "I believe in God." He was an Italian prelate, actually. If that were to occur, Andrew Rice continues, it would also echo what is happening in Catholic parishes throughout the developed world. In the United States, where a shrinking number of young men are willing to accept the sacrifices required for ordination, 1 in 6 of all diocesan priests and 1 in 3 seminarians are now foreign-born. The world's largest Catholic seminary is in Nigeria. When I went to my childhood home in South Carolina for the holidays last year, a visiting Nigerian priest celebrated Christmas Mass at my own family's parish. My question is this: where would we include these post-Western Catholics in the circle, to quote from the paper, of the world's thinking Catholics, even if they do not forswear the hierarchical church? Mostly poor, mostly powerless, and mostly marginal. Where do they belong on what Kaiser describes as the human side of the church? I ask this not so innocently.
I resonated with that rejoinder that your friend in the Vatican gave you, "I believe in God." He could have added, "and she's black." I ran into Cardinal Turkson the night he was made a cardinal. He's from Ghana, Cape Coast. And I asked him, it was at the end of a long receiving line, and I was the last one in line, and I said, "What would you prefer, a clerical church or a people's church?" Well, that provoked him, and we had a half-hour discussion about that. He kind of said, "Well, both," but we had a really good two-way conversation. It wasn't he speaking down to me or I speaking down to him. We were on an equal level, and I was impressed by his high intelligence. He spoke better English than I did. He had a background with the Jesuits in Rome at the Biblical Institute. And as we parted, I said to myself, if we're ever going to have an African pope, this is the guy. The last African pope we had was somewhere in the 400s. His name was Gelasius I. I would not be a bit surprised if he were elected pope. It's time. As Dr. Sene has pointed out, there's a shift demographically in the church to the southern hemisphere. Politically speaking, although he's from Ghana, he's been in the Vatican for the last 3 or 4 years. The Pope John Paul II brought him to Rome to head the Congregation of Justice and Peace. So in that office, he has gotten to meet every cardinal that ever comes to Rome to visit. I'm sure they call on him. And because he's at the Congregation for Justice and Peace, he's more interested in the real world than the ecclesiastical world. And I think he may well impress a lot of the people that come to the conclave. So just in a human political sense, he has he's a step ahead of cardinals who are not well known by the general population, 120 cardinals that come to Rome. My wish may be father to the thought, but so what? I just hope that the cardinals don't know that Kaiser is pushing for Turks, and then they'll say, well, we don't want him because Kaiser wants him. We'll see. I'm giving myself too much credit. Questions?
Just hold your cards up if you have a question, and they'll be collected.
I'm not against hierarchy, although I like that contrast between the pyramid and the circle. We all need hierarchy. Our basketball team has to take orders from the coach. Mr. Boissy's corporation has to take orders from him. But there's a difference between a basketball team and a modern corporation. The modern corporation head is not a absolute ruler ruling absolutely, as the Pope still is. He consults with the people down below, as it were. If he doesn't, especially if he has a company that's involved in technology, he's going to be, his company will soon be destroyed because he isn't keeping up with the times. And if he doesn't have an open door to all those engineers and scientists below him who are coming up with new ideas and making the corporation much more advanced and much more competitive with their rivals, then he's in trouble. So what we need are we need servant bishops, not lord bishops. And I go way back to Luke 22, where Jesus told the apostles, I'm giving you a new kind of authority, an authority of service, not domination. Let he who thinks he is the greatest among you, let him consider himself the least. And I think we've gotten away from that. Hope it's changing. I think bishops are afraid of losing their authority if they listen too hard. In fact, John the 23rd got more authority the more he gave it away. He used to joke with his secretary, Loris Capovilla. He'd say, looks like rain today. And his secretary would say, are you certain of that, Your Holiness? And he'd say, well, I'm not infallible, you know. He was a remarkable pope, the best pope we ever had, for my money, because he was so human and so down to earth and so non-sectarian. One story that Capovilla told me about the Pope was shortly before Vatican II, he had a visit from Roger Schutz, the prior of Taizé, a Calvinist monastery near Paris. And they had a great conversation. And toward the end, John the 23rd said, why can't we get together? And Schutz said, well, we have different ideas. And the Pope said, ideas. What are ideas among friends? You can make your conclusions from that. Yes?
All right, we have some questions from the audience, but I'm going to ask mine first.
Oh, okay.
Real quick. You already gave us an idea of who you would like as the next pope. What's your best guess? Who will be pope after Ratzinger? Not hopes, guess.
I just read a long piece this morning by Paul Collins, the theologian from Australia, who gave us a rundown on all of them, and I can't remember the name of the man that he thought would be most likely to be the Pope. He's an Italian, and he also studied with the Jesuits. He's a man of high culture. I'm prejudiced toward the Jesuits because I was one and I'm still one at heart. But Collins gave two other men, not the Italian, but Rodriguez Maradiaga of Honduras and Turkson of Ghana as he thought the two most qualified men to be Pope. But what do I know? I have a good friend in Rome, Robert Mickens, who's the tablet correspondent, and I rely upon him for the latest.
All
He's
right,
good.
thank you. This question from someone in the audience. What are your hopes for the future of the church, for young leaders, women and men within it?
That we capture our voice, that we get a vote, and that we become citizens in the church. We don't think of ourselves as citizens in the sense that we're citizens of New Haven or New York or Newcastle or Los Angeles, and we should. We should have a voice and a vote and citizenship in our church. The question is, how do we get it? How do we seize it? I have a kind of a utopian idea that I and a group who've been thinking outside the box have figured out that what we need is one courageous bishop who is 2 years out from retirement to invite his people of his diocese to elect his successor. And then he would take that man to the Holy Father and say, here's the people's choice. Daring the Pope to say, no, he cannot be the people's choice because I didn't appoint him. My fantasy is that a bishop who is the people's choice would be more of a servant bishop than a Lord bishop. He would have a much more vital diocese. He would encompass and enliven and impassion a whole new bunch of people. I think young people are leaving the church because they don't have a voice in it. If they had more of a voice, more of a say in the future of the church, I'm not talking about doctrine, I'm talking about governance, they'd be more with it.
Thank you. This apparently is the last question. We're running low on time, but I'm sure people can swarm you after the official end of this. Is the Catholic Church still moving in the direction of Vatican II's vision and encouraging full participation of the laity?
I would have to ask you, what church are you talking about when you say, is the Catholic Church? Are you talking about...
It is capitalized.
Are you talking about the hierarchical church or the people's church? Two different churches. If we understand that we are the church, then of course I'm optimistic. We're forging ahead. We're going to do it, whether the Vatican likes it or not.
Let the conversation continue to both our respondent and speaker. There is a wonderful reception prepared for you in both the lecture hall and the courtyard, in the dining hall and the courtyard. And I remind you, in the corner of the courtyard, there's a gratitude board, and we invite your reflection on what aspect of St. Thomas More's ministry has meant to you. And please write that reflection and post it on the board before you leave this evening. You're invited to the dining hall, and the mayor will read a proclamation. There'll be a few toasts, and the Whiffenpoofs will be here at 8. We're grateful for the mayor being here, for Bishop Razaza, for a Jesuit president of Fairfield University, and for a chaplain from that school in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I forgot the name of it, but I want to thank all of you for everything you've done to help make this ministry what it is today. Every one of you here plays a part in making St. Thomas More the great community it is. So thank you all for your contribution.